you, Andy, and thanks to all of you for inviting me here. I'll be honest, this was very humbling for myself, seeing the folks that you guys have had here for your lunch series over the semester, and just the different topics and the different issues. I didn't really think that this, my topic or my issue kind of raised to that level with some of those other folks. So I really appreciate it, and I certainly hope to learn a lot from you guys today with some of your insight and your questions. I'd start by saying that I come from Michigan. Start here. I come from Michigan, and over my short career in my college experiences, one thing I've come across is that fisheries comes down to basically people and fish. And in my mind, others would argue differently, but I think the fish are pretty simple. No matter where you go in the world, no matter if it's a lake, if it's a river, if it's an ocean, the fish want to do two things. They want to eat and they want to reproduce. But the more complicated side of things, as you go around different states, countries in the world, the people are much different. The values, the community, the culture, the economic system, the politics it's very diverse, and it changes. And so in my mind, the majority of my job, or the agency's position, is certainly we have to understand fish. We have to understand the dynamics and understand what's in the ocean. The larger challenge for me and for us is to understand the people, and that's why I gave it the title, a story about managing people. And so ultimately, we set up regulations that determine when people can fish, where they can fish, how they can fish, and how much, right? We set catch limits and quotas. And to do that, to be effective in management, we need to monitor the fishery in the form of, monitoring the fish that come to shoreside. We need to monitor the discards that are, occurring at sea. And certainly the regulations are very complicated, and so we work with enforcement agents and the Coast Guard to enforce the regulations. But ultimately, you see in the last bullet there is we're trying to maintain sustainable fish populations. Everybody has a different definition of sustainable, and maybe how much should be allowed to be removed from the ocean. Luckily, over time and through laws and research and things, we've come up with some pretty simple definitions to help guide us. And so if you see here, this is just kind of a generic concept or a model of a fish population, with the x-axis being, a small population on the left and a large population on the right, and then the yield that we can remove from that fishery. We would know that, on the far left here with a small amount of biomass, we can't really remove many fish because there's not many there in the first place. Conversely, all the way to the far right, we have a population that's very dense, and there's a lot of competition for resources. You're also not getting a lot of yield out of that biomass. And so ultimately, we're trying to, manage our fisheries to have a biomass somewhere in the middle. And the law defines this as, the MSY being the maximum sustainable yield. And the law would say that, anything to the, anything over here to the right is a stock that's not overfished, meaning there's a lot of biomass in the ocean, versus anything to the left of that curve would be a stock that is overfished. It's kind of our first metric that we're managing under. The second one would be, again, the same concept here of a population. And the far left on this graph would be the x-axis here would be the fishing mortality rate. So it's the rate of fish that we're removing from this population. Of course, on the far left would be we're not removing many fish at all the way over to the right, we're removing a lot of fish from the population. And so again, we're trying to manage here to the middle of setting a fishing mortality rate that's going to get us around maximum sustainable yield. In this case, if we look to the right for this model, if we're setting a rate of fishing that's to the right, we're overfishing that population, versus to the left of that curve, we're not overfishing it. So those, in my mind, and probably the law would state that those are kind of our two guiding principles in creating a sustainable fish population. Now, when we look nationally, this is information provided as of December 31st, 2014. This is a report that NOAA Fisheries puts out every quarter. And we look over nationally the different stocks that are overfished. So again, being in a state that is under where we would like it to be. So we look at the Pacific and the Western Pacific and the different regions, the Gulf of Mexico, South Atlantic, these are populations that the agency, the law, would be determined to be overfished. Now, I'll point you out to New England. In total, there's 12 different stocks. The first, I don't know, almost all of those are in the groundfish complex. So we're managing within the groundfish fishery a number of stocks that are determined to be overfished. A couple stocks of cod, halibut, wolffish, ocean pout, yellowtail, windowpane, winter, and witch flounder are all in the groundfish complex. Now, when we look at that second metric, what are the stocks that are subject to overfishing, meaning the fish being removed from that population are more than the law would suggest? Again, we look around the country and we see different stocks in different regions. But again, I would point you to New England. We have currently 8 stocks across all the fisheries that we manage that are being overfished. And the key point I would point out here is that these stocks in blue, 7 of the 8, were on the previous list, meaning they were overfished and overfishing is occurring, which is not very good. But it's not all doom and gloom. When we put out this report, we also put out the stocks that have recovered that are in a good state in terms of their population and the mortality rate on that fishery. And so we see success stories in all the different regions, and certainly many of them here in New England, some of them within the groundfish complex. Certainly the scallop fishery, many of you have heard of, is doing very well. So how do we manage the fishery? In its simplest form, Congress back in 1976 created the Magnuson-Stevens Act. It was basic law at the time that kind of set some of the precedent and the laws in place to help manage our domestic fisheries. Ultimately, the Congress, or as part of the Magnuson-Stevens Act, created Fisheries Management Councils, which work in tandem with us throughout the country. And the councils themselves develop fisheries management plans. And they do amendments and they do adjustments and different things to those plans that ultimately come to us to be put in the form of regulation that we then enforce and regulate. So let's dig a little deeper. The Magnuson-Stevens Act does a number of things. It spells out a number of things, but the primary are the 10 national standards. And some of them being pretty easy to understand, promote safety at sea, right? We want to minimize costs, avoid duplication, consider communities, minimize adverse impacts. There's a whole list of these 10 items that the Act spells out. But first and foremost, the overriding national standard would be prevent overfishing. And that's why I kind of set up the talk that way, to take you through, where we are with, overfishing and overfished populations. So the law sets these standards. And as I mentioned, the law also sets these fisheries management councils. So what's a management council? As an example, I'll take you through the New England Council, which I work with the most. It's made up of 18 voting members. First there on the list would be the NMFS Regional Administrator, which currently is John Bullard. He's the Regional Administrator here in my office. Each of these 5 states, Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, the sitting representative on that state's fishing agency, so the Massachusetts Department of Marine Fisheries, either the head or the deputy would sit on the board. And then a number of government nominated and secretary appointed people. So they might be fishing industry members. They could work for a fish processing company. There's a whole slew of just different possibilities that these people are appointed and they serve on this board. And then there's 4 non-voting members. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has representation, the Coast Guard, the Executive Director of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, and then sometimes the U.S. Department of State will send somebody. So these folks take, I would say, first and foremost, an issue. They identify an issue within a fishery. And ultimately, they set up a series of meetings, take a number of votes, and they develop these plans, these amendments, these adjustments to these fisheries through the process that you see here. So they go out to the public for scoping. They develop the different ideas. They have decisions at their council meetings. They do more public hearings. There's a lot of public process involved here, as you can see. And then ultimately, they make a final decision, take a final vote, and then that comes to the agency in the form of rulemaking, and we implement those plans. So what are our responsibilities as the agency here, the federal government? First and foremost, we're going to review those plans that come to us, and we can either give them a thumbs up, a thumbs down, or in some cases we might give a thumbs up on some pieces of it and a thumbs down on others. What we can't do is take what was given to us in a plan and kind of tweak it a little bit and then implement it how maybe we would want to. So ultimately it's a full approval, a full disapproval, or a partial approval. We issue permits. We do all the quota monitoring in implementing and enforcing these regulations. We have data collection programs to support these fisheries, such as observer programs or people that are at the shoreside facilities to collect information. And I think first and foremost that was new to me when I started at the agency was, you know, we have a legal responsibility for implementing the law, which means we're susceptible to lawsuits. We get sued a fair amount, and we've won some, we've lost some. In some cases, we've actually been sued on both sides of an issue, that we set a quota too high and at the same time set a quota too low. So we got sued from both sides. So the first three slides I stepped through was the law, the council, and the agency. And, you know, it was a slide each, and I kind of stepped through them. What I want to show you here is how complex that it actually gets when you look at all the different pieces, internal and external, to the system. So we have the law, we have the council, we have the agency. So typically when I mention when we identify an issue, the council identifies an issue, it's because there's some information, some data that came in. Say the fish population is overfishing is occurring, and we want to do something about that. So we have some data, we do some fish stock assessments. Then we have to look at some of the decisions that have made in the past. What are the policies that we've created in the past? What is the enforceability of an issue that we're going to put in place? How can we administer it, right? We pick apart these different things. Then we look at all the other laws across the country that we have to adhere to. And I won't go through all these acronyms, but there's a lot of them. Marine Mammal Protection Act, Endangered Species, Small Business Administration, Office of Management and Budget, Regulatory Flex Act. EOs are going to be executive orders that the past and current presidents have put into place. So anytime we consider making a change to the fishery, we got to consider all these different laws. The states have a role. As I mentioned, the state agencies are represented on the council, but the states have representatives and senators, right? They have their own regulations that they put into place in state waters, and they have a role at each of these different levels. The fishing industry, not without question that a fisherman might write a letter to their, state representative or senator or governor or whoever it might be. They attend council meetings. They're on the council. Right now my phone doesn't stop ringing. They're calling me all the time. So the fishing industry has a large role in this system. The public, everyone in this room has the opportunity to voice your concerns in the ballot box, to write letters, to call people, to attend council meetings, to call me up and say, hey, I got a question about something. The public is very involved. NGOs, right? They have a role in each of these different levels in terms of their concerns, their constituents at every part of the process. So as you can see, as simple as it seems as a law, a council, and an agency, it can get very, very dynamic. The Northeast region alone is from the Canadian border down to North Carolina. 13 states, which means there's 13 governors, 26 senators, dozens of representatives, I don't know how many mayors. I would say a very diverse culture, a very diverse fishing industry, diverse in every way. And so it can get very, very complex. So ultimately, we're putting regulations into place. I'm going to take a moment here to refreshen my palate. So in that previous slide, I mentioned that this whole process starts when an issue is identified. We collect some data, and we consider something to be overfished or overfishing occurring. And so that's where the science comes into place, and we do these stock assessments. Certainly it'd be probably relatively easy to be a stock assessment for the National Forest Service, right? You can count all the trees. Fisheries is not so simple. They're underwater and they're moving, and it's very difficult. And so what is a stock assessment in its kind of basic sense? We want to recreate what's happened in the past, so we can look at trends, say, dozens of years ago over time as the fishery has evolved. We want to look at the present state, so basically an assessment of what we think is in the water as of today. And then understanding what's in the water today in terms of the age structure of the populations. Are they spread out in certain areas? Are they condensed into certain areas? Are there a lot of age 3 fish? Are there not a lot of age 3 fish? All these different factors go into then predicting what do we think is going to happen in the future? What's going to happen next year? What's going to happen in 2 years, 3 years? So that we can set quotas and catch limits from years out from what we know now. Answers to these questions rely on models and data collection. So what I've set up here is it's a very basic stock assessment. I'm not a stock assessment biologist and won't ever try to be one. It's very difficult. But essentially what you're looking at here is, at this moment in time, we're trying to determine the biomass of the stock. We know that, young fish are coming into the stock. We know that fish are growing both in length and weight. We know that there's fishing mortality on that population in the forms of fish being landed and fish being discarded. And certainly there's, natural mortality due to different environmental factors. And ultimately, we're trying to figure out, okay, where's, if we're in year 2014 or 15, what are they going to be, the following year? So growth, landings, discards, those are all things that we can measure. We can go to a seafood dealer, and as the fish are being unloaded, we can count those fish. We can put observers on boats to monitor the discards. These are observable quantities. Natural mortality, though, is not an observable quantity, right? We have to use our research and our information that's being gathered to try and make a determination of what's being, what's happening naturally. And so these are going to be things like the life expectancy of a species, predation, different disease, climate change is a big one, right? The temperatures get warmer, and perhaps maybe fish move. So what I want to take you through now is all the different components that could possibly be in a stock assessment. I probably am not even doing it justice because there's probably more that I'm not even aware of. So when we go through this, it's going to get really complicated. But in the end, what I just want you to understand is that it's complicated and not to necessarily understand all the details of this. So in a stock assessment, one of the things you might include would be fisheries surveys. So NOAA has big white ships that go out in the ocean in the spring and the fall, and they go into different random areas to collect information, collect the lengths and weights of all the different fish that they're collecting. And ultimately, there's scallop surveys, shrimp, clam, there's state surveys. Ultimately, what they're trying to do is, or one of the things they're trying to do is age the fish. How long is a haddock when it's 3 years old? How long is a haddock when it's 4 years old? How long is a haddock when it's 5 years old? So for all the different species, they're doing an ALK, an age length key, to determine for all the species what's the fishery's age or size. Now the fishery is occurring, right? So now we have fishermen that are going out and prosecuting, these species, collecting these, fishing for these species throughout the ocean. So we have fish being landed, we get dealer records. We have port agents that go out and sample the fish for biological metrics as the fish are being landed. The fishermen send us vessel trip reports. We have state-specific fisheries that we're monitoring the state landings. And then in Groundfish, we have groups of vessels called sectors. So all this information is being collected, and we're trying to figure out where did it come from. When a cod comes to a dealer in, say, Boston, we have to determine, was that cod caught in Stat Area 521, which would be Georges Bank cod, or is that fish caught in Stat Area 514, that would be a Gulf of Maine cod. So ultimately, out of all these anonymous fish being landed, we got to figure out where they came from. We got to age them and then determine by the landings, the discards, by area where they're coming from. We have observers, both the National Observer Program, and we have non-federal observers that are collecting the discard information from all these fisheries. Again, we're monitoring the quota on all these fisheries using some of this information, but we're trying to get discard information, total discards, and ultimately what we're trying to get is over here. We have landings at age by stock area and gear type. We have discards at age by stock, gear, and area, and then that gives us the ultimate that we're all going after here is catch at age by stock area and gear type. And everything that I've mentioned so far above this line is all commercial fisheries. So what's the missing piece? You got to remember that there's recreational fisheries. So we're basically doing the same process here that I've mentioned above for all the recreational fisheries, collecting information for fish being discarded, fish being landed. But there's more. Cooperative research project, there's different universities, state agencies throughout the coast that are trying to examine, say, what's the mortality rate of a cod caught by a trawl that's thrown back to the ocean? Did 50% of them die? Did 20% of them die? Do all of them die? There's people that are out there looking at, they tag halibut and they release the halibut and they look at different features of the, how well does that recovery rate of a halibut that's discarded. So looking at mortality, or do they move? All these different projects are being done, on commercial and recreational vessels. That information comes in to help inform assessments. And certainly as research is being done, there's a lot of other information being gathered. So we're learning a lot about the ecosystem. So that's a stock assessment. Correct. So the question was the mortality of the fish by, say, the gear type, right? So the mortality of a fish caught by a hook may be different from a fish caught in a trawl, which may be different from a fish caught in a gill net. So for example, a hooked fish that comes up from 300 feet in depth may have barotrauma in terms of it coming up from the bottom and being picked up, pulled off the hook and released, versus a fish caught in a trawl that's maybe caught with another 1,500 pounds of fish and assorted things in the trawl, has maybe it's been pressed up against the net. It also has been brought up from the bottom, versus go ahead. Purse seines? Birth rate. Right. So, I mean, that's part of in the initial basic model that I was showing was, part of doing these surveys, part of doing the research and collecting the commercial information is trying to figure out how many year one fish are in the population. So the surveys that the agency would do would collect all the fish that shows up in the net and determine how many year one fish are there. And in a given fishing year, it might be plenty. In another fishing year, given different factors, there could be very little. And so it's building that. I almost look at it like like when we do the human census, human census or citizen census every 10 years of looking at, the curve of age structure over time. And there's folks that do that, and that's really, it is in this model, kind of glossing over some of the really specific details. So ultimately, we have all these different considerations and information that's coming out of an assessment. We identify a model. There's an amount of uncertainty under the data or the parameters that we're putting into a model. But as I mentioned before, one of the points or one of the objectives of an assessment is to project into the future fishing year how many fish are we going to allow to be caught. So that's our projection of what we would call the OFL, the overfishing limit, and then an ABC, an acceptable biological catch. This information is peer-reviewed and then is provided to the Science and Statistical Committee, which is a branch of the council. So a bunch of folks that are really smart with stock assessments get to look at this information, give it a thumbs up, thumbs down, a tweak, whatever it may be, and provide it to our regional office for us to examine it, back to the councils for them to examine it, and to the Fisheries Commission. So ultimately, that data piece that came in, that question that came into the council to examine the stock, what we want to do with it, goes through that whole assessment process to then be provided to these folks to then make some decisions. I mentioned the management plans that the council set up. They develop environmental impact statements, environmental assessments. We go through that public comment process. I mentioned how the public has quite a bit of influence here. And then eventually we do a rulemaking and we go into regulations and we monitor that fishery. Seems easy enough, right? So let's talk New England groundfish. I moved out from Michigan about 6 years ago. I applied for the job, of course got it. I'm like, why is this fishery so complicated? Like, you don't hear about groundfish in Michigan. That doesn't make the news. Nobody talks about it. What are all these critters and why is it so complicated? Well, the groundfish complex as a whole is actually 13 different species. Cod, haddock, redfish, different hakes and flounders. You've heard of probably most, if not all of them. They're fished together, meaning when you pull a net through the water, you're going to catch most of them. You put a gill net in the water, you're going to catch most of them. So therefore, they're managed together. In some cases, though, there's species that are broken up into different stocks. Georges Bank cod versus Gulf of Maine cod. Georges Bank winter flounder, Southern New England winter flounder, Gulf of Maine winter flounder. But ultimately, we have 20 different stocks that we're managing. Over time, the fishery did its thing, but at a certain point in time in the early 90s, started to put in some measures to manage the fishery in the form of different mesh sizes in the nets, minimum fish size restrictions, but we still saw a decline in the stocks themselves. So it was determined, okay, we've identified an issue. We now realize that issue is growing. So in 1994 was a big shift in the fishery. We started to put fishermen on days at sea, meaning they could only go out so many days during the year. We limited the number of people that could fish in the fishery, which would be a limited access fishery. At the time, I don't know what the exact number was. It was probably over 2,000. Right now, there's about 1,500 limited access permits in the fishery. But we set trip limits, target catch levels, and we closed a large portion of the ocean in setting up some different closed areas in some of the areas we determined to be protective in nature for the fishery. And then we also increased the mesh size. So you grow the mesh size, then the smaller fish pass through the net. And so the idea being that you're going to catch larger fish. In 1996, there was an amendment to the Magnuson-Stevens Act. And one of the big things that happened at that time was it basically said for every stock that you're managing, you need to attempt to rebuild that stock within 10 years. And so in a part of setting up the management plans with the council, you've got to put that horizon out there of 10 years. We've got to set our measures, our gears, our areas, our quotas, all these different things to try and rebuild the stock within a 10-year period. Into the 2000s, stocks were still declining. We reduced days at sea. We lowered trip limits. But if you can imagine, if I caught the trip limit for cod at one time in the Gulf of Maine was 30 pounds, and I, drag my net through the water and I catch 600 pounds of cod on a single tow, it's all being thrown back, right? Lost revenue, waste of the fish type of, kind of concept. So, the reduced days at sea, the lowered trip limits was certainly unpopular with the fishery. Nor effective at rebuilding the stocks. And so a program that was started in the mid-2000s, which was greatly expanded beginning in 2010, was what we call the sector management system. And the idea being, here at the bottom, is it's basically a voluntary group of vessels or permits that we calculated a catch history for every permit. And we said, based on what you fished in the past, given a certain period of time, we're going to give you a little piece of the pie, so to speak. But we're not going to give it just to you. In order for you to get your piece of the pie, you have to join one of these sectors. And if you do that, you all get together and we all put our pieces of pie together, we're going to issue that quota to the collective group. We're not necessarily giving it to each of you individually, but if you all join together, we'll give you that collective quota. And so in 2010, I'd say 99% of the fishery joined sectors. There was at the time, I think 18 or 19 different sectors up and down the coast. So you might have a sector out of Boston that's all draggers. You might have a sector out of Gloucester that's all gill netters. They were able to form their sector how they chose to, based on geography, gear type, politics, friendships, enemies, things like that. And in doing so, what we did is we said, okay, if this is going to be your quota for the year, we're going to pull off some of the regulations that we've had in the past. We're going to get rid of days at sea. So if you want to fish all your quota in one day, by all means, go for it. If you want to, some of the other things we did is we changed maybe the mesh sizes, some of the gear restrictions we had. We've since opened up portions of some closed areas that allow fishermen to fish in these areas. So we've basically pulled back the regulatory reins on these fishermen for the sectors because they're self-managing. And we're still monitoring and regulating the fishery, but that's the basic concept of a sector. They can transfer their quota from one sector to another. So I'm running out of Georges Bank cod, but I've got a lot of redfish. I can swap with folks. You can swap fish for fish. You can pay for your fish. Some people, maybe exchange fuel. Maybe it's ice. All forms and fashions of trading to allow the fishery to try to be as efficient as possible. What does remain, though, is a group of vessels that are non-sector vessels. So we call them the common pool. For the most part, it's going to be your hook fishermen in the Gulf of Maine. It's going to be some draggers in southern New England that target yellowtail. By and large, sectors are the vast majority of the fishery. What isn't talked a lot about when sector management came about was that in 2010, it was the first year that at the same time, we also put in annual catch limits, meaning it's a hard quota for the fishery, and accountability measures for those quotas. So if you go over your quota for Georges Bank haddock, which is a bad example because that's probably the healthiest stock. Let's go with Georges Bank cod. You go over by 1,000 pounds, your sector has to pay that back. And so the idea being that we're setting a hard limit for each stock, and if you go over, you're going to be accountable to that overage. So it's kind of a tough position here. We're changing the fishery system and how it's managed, how it's monitored, how the data is being collected. At the same time, we're also kind of putting a ceiling on the fishery and putting accountability in there. It's been a very interesting adjustment. Some have adjusted well, some have not. This basically just gives you a breakdown about the proportionality of sectors to common pool, so you can see that for most of these stocks, Gulf of Maine cod, 97% of the fishery is in a sector versus the remaining few percent that's in the common pool. So, when you hear about the groundfish fishery, different issues, it's primarily, sector-related issues, because that's who's fishing. For the most part, the common pool is a smaller, didn't want to join a big group of permits, maybe fish on their own. They don't catch a lot of fish, things like that. So, scaling down from the groundfish fishery in general, let's talk a little bit about Gulf of Maine cod. In 2008, there was a stock assessment, and that assessment came back and said the fishery is rebuilding. It's on target to meet its 10-year rebuilding plan. Things are good. In 2011, a new stock assessment came along, and basically what it found was quite the opposite of what was discovered in 2008. The stock was much smaller than previously found. It was determined to be about 20% of the MSY that we'd like it to be at, right? And that overfishing was occurring at the level of 5 times the amount. Even if no fishing was to be allowed, there was no possibility to rebuild the stock by 2014. And what was also kind of determined at the time is that even before sectors came along in 2010, there was already some declines that were happening in 2008 and 2009. And so obviously, this is a huge news to the fishery. Things are great. 3 years later, they're not. So immediately, folks said, okay, let's figure out which assessment was right. Was it the 2008 assessment? Was it the 2011 assessment? So we immediately, the next year, did another benchmark review of the stock. And it more or less confirmed what we had done in 11, that the stock is not in good shape. Rebuilding is not happening. Ultimately, in 2014, so last summer, we did an updated assessment, which essentially kind of kept the same model that we've been using, but it just added 2 more years worth of survey data, 2 more years of VTRs, 2 more years of dealer records, those types of things to look at, okay, how are we doing now 2 years later? And in fact, we found that despite the lowest amount of catch allowed over time, the fishery is in potentially its worst shape on record. Spawning stock biomass is estimated to be 3 to 4% of the biomass of MSY. And all the indices that we've looked at in terms of age structure, they're at all-time lows. Now, certainly, as you can imagine, I've taken you through kind of a simple form of assessment and more complex version. There's a lot of uncertainty, and people may see things in the water that don't conform with what comes out on paper. I would say fair enough, and I would agree that assessments aren't a perfect science. But even if we doubled the amount of what we thought was available out there and said, okay, we're off, let's just double what we think's out there, we're still at 6 to 8% of EMSY, right? So we're not in good shape. So actions have been taken and will continue to be put forward within days, actually. So what were our next steps after that assessment last summer? The New England Council considered a number of options, but part of the issue is that the council can't act very fast, right? We've got to go through all those different steps of public hearings and meetings and votes and things. They basically said, agency, we need you to take emergency action. Please consider, area closures, consider recreational, commercial measures, and reevaluate some of the exemptions that you've been giving sectors over time. So we did that. And November 13th, 2014, we put in an emergency action. Basically did 5 things. We put in area closures, which had never been, we've always had some closures, but we put in a whole bunch more. Basically 1 every month, and I'll show you here in a minute where they are. We put in a trip limit for Gulf of Maine cod of 200 pounds for all commercial vessels. On November 12th, they didn't have a trip limit, so this is a big shock to them that all of a sudden, I got to only keep 200 pounds of cod when I go fishing. Now we're back to that historical issue of can only land so much, got to discard a bunch. It's a big problem. We restricted people from fishing in the Gulf of Maine and other areas. So if you're going to fish in the Gulf of Maine for Gulf of Maine cod, you got to stay there. You can't start in the Gulf of Maine and go to Georges Bank and then come back. Helps us enforce the trip limit, right? If you're fishing in different areas, how do we know exactly where the cod came from and where was the 200 pounds caught from? So we said, basically, you're stuck in the Gulf of Maine if you want to fish there. There was an exemption we had been granting over time that allowed vessels to use more gill nets than they were traditionally allowed. We revoked that exemption. And then another one that I'd say goes under the radar to some degree, but it's a big issue, is we said for recreational vessels, no more Gulf of Maine cod. You catch one, throw it back. So some of these area closures that I mentioned, if you look down on the bottom right during the month of November, I know we're kind of starting a little awkward here, but basically this is when the emergency action took effect. And the closures that we implemented were what you see in dark. It was basically down to the South Shore, all the way up to middle of New Hampshire, going out to sea quite a ways. What you'll see on every single one of these charts is another box or figure with a bunch of dots in it. Those are the permanent closures that have been in place for a really long time. So essentially the fishermen during the month of November, they couldn't fish in those dark areas, nor could they fish in the areas with the little polka dots. And so you can see that, okay, before they had some areas to deal with, and now with this closure, they had a large area to deal with. And so over the months, November, December, and then we go back to the top left, January, February, March, these are the closures that the fishermen have had to deal with, where we've restricted them commercially and recreationally from fishing. We see here in the month of April, as we speak today, again, very large area closed, and these are set up to basically protect Gulf of Maine cod. Now, the idea is that the council, we helped them we didn't help them, they requested emergency action, we did it. They've been simultaneously working on another framework adjustment to basically supersede this action. They have now allowed themselves time to vote and deal with these issues and come up with a plan, with the idea being that they're going to put their framework in place, or we would do that for them. They give us the plan, we put it in place, and it would subsequently kind of wipe out all these closures that you see, going forward. So when we did our emergency action in November, we assumed we need to do this for at least 12 months. However, the council has then since taken action, with the idea being on May 1st, we're going to kind of supersede this suite of management measures. In mid-March or early March, well, let me stop for a second. Clearly, those measures that we put in place were not popular by a lot of people, right? Can't fish in all these areas. You got to throw back cod, taking away exemptions. And so immediately sectors and the fishing industry started coming up with some ideas. Okay, what can we do? Let's figure out some way to kind of, mitigate some things here for a while. And so what they did is and it's the beauty of the sector system, it allows the fishery to kind of manage itself in some ways, is they said, we are going to reserve 30 metric tons of Gulf of Maine cod. Basically, a bunch of sectors all pooled a little bit of cod together. They set it aside. It's locked in. They can't use it. They can't trade it. They can't take it to next fishing year. They can't fish it. It's locked in. From our perspective, what that did is it said, okay, if the catch limit for the year was 800 metric tons, effectively now it's 770. So it gave us a guarantee 30 metric tons that we could take off the books. Sort of a win there. So what we said is, okay, you give us 30 metric tons, you set it aside in exchange for, we're going to remove the trip limits, and we're going to allow them to fish in multiple areas again. We granted that exemption on March 4th. So that's the current state of affairs. We took the action in November, and we've since given some of the exemptions back. On March 9th, the framework that the council had put together and given us, we proposed to the public of proposed measures for the upcoming fishing year, which begins May 1. One of the things we proposed is a quota. So the 366 would be the quota that would be given to the entire fishery, commercial sectors and common pool, the recreational community, fisheries and state waters. That's the amount of fish that would be proposed to be the quota for the entire fishing year. Sectors would get about 202 metric tons of that. Now for, I don't know, a minute or so here, I want you to remember those two numbers, specifically the 202 metric tons. The other thing that Framework 53 does is it basically wipes out those emergency closures, and it puts in some of its own protection areas, Gulf of Maine cod protection areas. And then the other thing that it also recommended is to remain the prohibition for recreational vessels. Fishing year 15 begins May 1st, so that's 8 days away. And the time is ticking. We're hoping to get everything announced and put into a final rulemaking. It may be happening as I speak. Now, you recall the emergency closures that we put into place. And this kind of set up the same way with January down to December from top to bottom. So the idea being is if we put these measures, these closed areas into place, come May 1st, the fishery would be closed out of this whole purple section during the month of May, inclusive of the boxes in the area with the polka dots for the entire month of May. So you can see that Framework 53 proposes to also close some pretty large portions of the ocean. Again, in June, you'd see another big set of closures. And this actually mirrors somewhat some of the closures that we've always had in place. So before the emergency action, we did have some of these seasonal closures. But then you see in the month of July, no seasonal closures, blah, blah, blah. October, this would be a closure that would apply to just the common pool. What I'm trying to show you here is that, from the emergency closures of having one every month, sectors would end up having, let's see, January, May, June, November, and December. So the idea here being that we're focusing these closures on Gulf of Maine cod. We're going to give the fishery back some flexibility to fish in some areas that they've always been fishing in. So is cod important to Gloucester? Yes. So this shows you over time, the years starting in early 60s over into 2010, with the y-axis showing you landings. Now, what was the number that I wanted everybody to remember? 202. Where do we find 202 on this y-axis? Way down there. The quota proposed next year for all of sectors is a blip on this graph. So it shows you over time, how much cod was landed in these different ports, Gloucester namely being the top dog, but several others. Over time, how much cod was being landed on the order of 5,000 metric tons in a given year in the city of Gloucester alone. Now we see over time into the 90s and the 2000s where I took us through the management measures that were put into place and we ratcheted down days at sea and we did trip limits and all these things. You can see landings certainly declined. And you can see, some bottoming out, so to speak. And then into, up to 2010, landings increased in the city of Gloucester. Well, for the entire fishery, for the entire coast of New England, a quota of 202 metric tons when they historically have been landing, on the order of, 100 times as much. When you look at the proportion that is landed in Gloucester, so the previous graph was just the raw amount. This would just show the proportion. So collectively in a given year, if you added up all these cities, it would equal 100%, right? So, back in 1970, Gloucester landed 40% of the Gulf of Maine cod, thereabouts, for a good 15, 20 years. And we look at all the way up into 2010, Gloucester landed about 60% of the Gulf of Maine cod for a given fishing year. So yes, cod is very important in Gloucester. With that, hopefully I've been able to synthesize the science and the management in 40 or 50 minutes. Certainly some takeaways. It's very complex. It's very complicated. There's hundreds of years worth of culture. There's lots of politics. There's lots of economics. There's lots of opinions. You find that commercial fishermen from one port disagree with the management measures from fishermen in another port. You find that the recreational fishing community, blames all the commercial fishermen and vice versa. It's a very complicated system. I think everybody's always hopeful, right? You always feel like you're optimistic as whoever you are, that, the fishery is going to rebound and, people will be bringing back, the hundreds of thousands of pounds of cod that they used to bring back. And we'll see. Hopefully the management measures that we'll be putting into place in the short term help in the long term. One of my jobs currently is to examine the healthy stocks, redfish, pollock, white hake, haddock. What are some ways that we can target those healthy stocks without harming those less healthy stocks? So that's part of the sector exemption process. How do we create a carrot over here that gets people to go target something that's in a healthy shape and leave the cod alone, so to speak? And so as a consumer, as any of you, I would say, look into the information about the health of these different stocks. You could go back to that website I originally showed you about what's overfished and what's being overfishing is occurring, and just simply look and say, okay, well, here's a handful of fish that aren't overfished and overfishing isn't occurring. And, instead of maybe buying haddock that, might have come in from Canada or Norway, I'll buy some redfish and, throw that on the grill or make some soup out of that. Because in my mind, that's really what would help fishermen is, right now, if redfish is 30 cents a pound, yeah, they could go catch millions of pounds of it. But if it comes back and it only pays for their fuel and their crew, well, there's not really a big incentive there. So that's a big thing right now is to try and help promote U.S. fishermen, U.S. caught fish, and that starts with consumers, willing to, go maybe buy something they haven't tried before and support the fishermen. So with that, I'll stop talking. I want to thank everybody again. This is really cool. Thanks for your time and answer any questions. Oh, yeah. No, so the question was, painted a picture of doom and gloom, and what are the next steps? It was a picture of doom and gloom. Just alone, just that last chart that I showed, the quotas that we're setting relative to what it's been in the past, it's very hard right now. I think one thing that the management measures that we're trying to put in place do some of the things I just mentioned about trying to get people to target other things. If the quota is so low for Gulf of Maine cod, and I only have so much of it, I need to figure out a way to go fish for haddock. Or maybe today I'm not going to go fish for groundfish at all and I'm going to go lobstering. Or maybe I'm going to go herring fishing. Or maybe I'm going to go tuna fishing. So, some of these measures are prohibitive in nature to try and move people elsewhere. We're also at the same time trying to put a carrot out there to get people to do other things. I would say that it's an evolving process. The areas that we would be putting in place in the next fishing year aren't perfect. There's probably some cod outside of those areas that people could catch. And there's probably some of the areas being closed that maybe there's not as much cod there. But, you know, once these measures, you know, we announce them and they get put in place and fishermen start going out there in the first months of the year, a new issue is identified by the council, and they'll start meetings. They'll have a meeting in June, they'll have a meeting in September to tweak once again. We do probably pretty much every year now we do a new framework, and these areas are constantly changing. The quotas are constantly changing, and we put everything through a fine-tooth comb to make adjustments. But great question. So supply and demand and the whole economic model. If there were some fishermen that were standing right next to me today, they would say, some of them might say that even if we went out and bought, you know, you all went to the marketplace and bought U.S. caught fish, wouldn't matter, because there's so much seafood that comes in from foreign countries. And, you know, the economic model of the United States is I'm going to buy it probably at the cheapest, right? And so if the price of buying fish from this U.S. fisherman is too high for me to make a profit as a seafood dealer, I'm going to go find another country that's catching that same fish and importing it here. And so one of the things that a lot of fishermen have said, that by setting the quotas where we have and kind of restricting things, one thing it's done is it's created a place where the U.S. has lost its market share, that dealers have to meet the demands of the consumers, and so they're going other places to find fish. And the chaotic nature, the roller coaster nature of some of the quotas that we set don't allow seafood dealers and processors to rely upon the U.S. system to say set a contract or a horizon of purchasing fish. And that's a big challenge. You know, we're trying to set these catch limits abiding by the law, but at the same time, there's some big ramifications downstream in the economic world that it kind of causes some havoc. So I say, you know, I'm an optimist. I say, you know, continue as best you can to buy U.S. caught fish, and hopefully that would be reflected in the prices eventually that fishermen see. Yep. So good question. What dictates the stocks? A little bit of everything, I would say. I mean, I think there certain part of it has to do with maybe some genetics and just different behavior of the fish, and kind of they just naturally maybe find some different places to stay or move to. So for example, pollock, we would call it a unit stock, meaning it's the same stock whether you caught it in near Canada or down off North Carolina. Conversely, we have other species we break up. I think a big part of why we have stocks is because we put in these, they're not arbitrary, but they're lines we put in the ocean to manage differently. So for a long time, the Georges Bank cod trip limits were much higher than the Gulf of Maine, in part because the Gulf of Maine had so much more pressure on it. Let's say, you know, 100 boats versus only 10 on Georges Bank. And that's just a, you know, kind of a generic number I'm throwing out there. But part of the reason we have different stocks is for management purposes. Yeah.
So to your last point about consumers sort of shifting their buying preferences, I've heard that the commercial marketing and labeling of fish is a real mess. And people buy squad or white fish and they don't actually know what that fish is or where it's coming from. So I've heard people asking the fish be marketed more the actual origin of the fish.
Yeah, so the question being, you know, there's a little bit of uncertainty in the marketplace in terms of when people are purchasing fish, where did it really come from? That's a very good point. I've talked to fishermen that would say, I just fished all day. I had to fill out reports. You know, I was up at 3 in the morning. I don't care to tell some story about the fish that I've caught. I just want to unload it at the docks and go home. And so part of this is trying to convince or, you know, get fishermen on board with this concept of people want to hear the story of how the fish were caught. You do see really good examples of that up and down the coast of small community-based organizations that are helping tell the story and kind of do that promotional work for fishermen. And there are fishermen that are involved. Another part of it, though, is dealers themselves. Typically, when the fish come to the auction house, you know, there might be some information on there, but eventually it's probably lost in the shuffle that, okay, this is just a haddock, and it could have come from his boat or her boat or their boat. And there's a big push to basically do that traceability from the boat, you know, to the docks, you know, to the truck, to the Shaw's grocery store type of thing. But it's something as an agency, we can't necessarily mandate that. It needs to come organically from consumers, you know, asking for that, and the fishermen and the people that support the fishermen to kind of, you know, complete that process. Andy. Yeah, so the question is, you know, there have been movements through history where a behavior in, you know, subsidizing or, you know, collecting the proteins from the environment to feed everybody has shifted from a non-commercial enterprise, or, you know, to a you probably give me some better terms, but I understand what you're saying. Kind of a shift from, you know, it's not a commercial enterprise anymore in the ocean, and we just need to get the fish out of there. I would say look at the scallop industry, right? So that's almost $1 billion industry. There's a lot of people fishing for scallops. There's a lot of jobs being supported by the scallop industry, and that is exactly a case where people are going out and fishing. You know, they're not fish, they're not moving anywhere, but they're harvesting something from the ocean, and there's a lot of benefits from it. I think Groundfish is in that, at that crossroads, that the idea behind an owner-operator and trying to maintain or increase employment in that fishery is meeting head-on with the fact that, you know, stocks are low, and it's a commercial enterprise, so there's haves and there's have-nots, and there's some people that would say, you know what, we need to cut 30% of this fishery and allow the rest of us to profit. I think that's going to be you're going to have, collectively, the public, the fishery is going to have a very hard time changing from the last 400 years of how the fishery is operated. I think that you're going to have people that will just, until the day they die, are going to fight it and say, I want to be a captain. I want to, you know, take my 50-foot boat out of Gloucester and go fishing for groundfish. And that's fine. And I mean, I completely understand that. But right now is like, it's been going on for a number of years, but I mean, that is the crux of the groundfish fishery right now is, do we just say, hey, we're not going to employ that many fishermen, the ocean can only sustain so many boats and fishermen, that we're going to move to a fishery of 30 to 40 boats and say that those are the people that are going to, you know, they're going to go harvest the protein out of the ocean for us in terms of groundfish. So stay tuned. Questions, I'm sure you can come on and chat. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you.